Picture this: a sealed reading chamber, deep beneath the frozen surface of a moon orbiting a dead star at the heart of the galaxy. The walls are made of grown crystal, humming faintly with the stored memories of 40,000 civilizations. The air is kept at a temperature precisely calibrated to preserve organic data slates for 10 million cycles. And in the center of this chamber sits a single archivist, hunched over a reader, watching the crystalline recording medium fracture in real time. This was the night the Galactic Concordance learned what humans actually are. The archivist's name was Vel. He was a member of the Velthari hive caste, a species whose minds are distributed across millions of crystalline nodes, capable of holding the entire population count of a galactic arm in working memory without strain. He had read census submissions for 800 cycles. He had processed numbers that would shatter a biological brain. He had never, in all that time, seen a slate crack from the data it was trying to hold. We know what happened in that chamber because the recording survived. Barely. It sits today in the sealed Concordance Archive, Vault Tier Black, accessible only to extinct species historians and those of us who study the strange, brief period when humanity was a member of the galactic community. The recording shows Vel reading the human submission, pausing, reading it again, and then very slowly setting the slate down as if it might bite him. It did not bite him. It did something far worse. It told him the truth. How did one quiet semantic logician from a small university on Earth bring the entire bureaucracy of the galaxy to a complete and permanent halt without raising her voice, without telling a single lie, and without breaking a single law? That is the story we are going to uncover tonight. Before we descend into the cracked crystal vaults of the Concordance, if you find yourself drawn to these forgotten corners of galactic history, the strange moments when small species did large things, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please leave a comment letting me know what part of the galaxy you're listening from. I find it remarkable that we explore these stories together, scattered across so many worlds, connected by our shared fascination with what happens when bureaucracy meets a species that takes questions seriously. To understand how a single census submission cracked the Concordance, you have to understand what the census was for. And to understand that, you have to understand what kind of empire the Concordance actually was, because it was not, as humans first assumed, a government. It was something stranger, older, and far more patient. It was an accounting firm with weapons. Part 2. The Galactic Concordance had governed the populated arm of the galaxy for somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million cycles. Nobody knew exactly. The records were too fragmentary, and the species that might have remembered were no longer present to ask. What everyone agreed on was the structure. Every 400 cycles, the Concordance Census Bureau issued a request to every member species. The request was simple: submit your population range. Lower bound, upper bound, honest estimate. The Bureau did not care about exact numbers. It cared about ranges, because ranges allowed for what the Bureau called administrative flexibility. A species that submitted a range of 2 billion to 3 billion would be assessed for resources, infrastructure, and what the Bureau politely called population sustainability indices. If a species was found to be over its sustainable threshold, the Bureau would issue a resource reduction quota. The quota would be enforced by the Concordance Adjustment Service, a fleet of vessels staffed by the Hesh, a species whose anatomy made them incapable of feeling reluctance. The Hesh did not enjoy their work. They did not dislike it. They simply performed it accurately on schedule with full documentation. In the 800,000 cycles of the Concordance, the Hesh had adjusted the populations of 147 species. Most of them no longer existed. A few existed in significantly smaller forms. The lesson was understood across every member species, in every language, on every world. You did not submit honest population numbers. You submitted survivable population numbers. You stayed small enough to be ignored. There were rituals around this. The Clethni submitted the same number every cycle, regardless of actual change. The Bromal Confederacy maintained an entire ministry whose sole function was producing convincingly conservative estimates. The Oregon migratory flocks had, over 40,000 cycles, slowly compressed their official population by a factor of 6, while their actual population had quietly tripled. Everyone lied. Everyone knew everyone else lied. The Bureau knew that everyone lied. The Bureau did not care, because the Bureau was not trying to count populations. The Bureau was trying to maintain a stable, predictable galaxy in which every species submitted survivable numbers, and the Hesh fleet had just enough work to remain operational. The system functioned. It had functioned for longer than most species had existed. It would, all observers assumed, continue to function forever. And then humanity joined the concordance. Humans were admitted as provisional members in cycle 847,221. The admission was unremarkable. They were a young species, technologically modest, biologically unimpressive. They had 3 small colonies outside their home system, and a population that the Bureau initially estimated at somewhere in the low billions. The standard briefing package was delivered to their delegation. The package explained the census, the quotas, and the adjustment service. It did not explicitly say submit conservative numbers. It did not have to. Every species understood. Every species nodded politely and went home and began drafting their first survivable estimate. Humanity nodded politely. Humanity went home. Humanity did not, as far as anyone could tell, begin drafting anything for a very long time. What humanity actually did during those 4 years is the part of the story the concordance still refuses to discuss. Part 3. To comprehend why the concordance feared honest numbers so deeply, we have to go back 12,000 cycles, to the moment that taught every species in the galaxy the unbreakable rule of the census. The species were called the Sithari. They were a peaceful, scholarly people who lived on a single forested world and 3 orbital habitats. They were known throughout the concordance for their honesty, which was not a virtue in their culture but a neurological feature. The Sithari brain was simply incapable of producing deliberate falsehoods. When the Sithari received their first census request, 4 cycles after joining the concordance, they submitted exactly what was asked for. Their lower bound was 3.2 billion. Their upper bound was 3.4 billion. Their honest estimate was 3.3 billion. The numbers were precise, well documented, and entirely accurate. The Bureau processed the submission. The Bureau calculated the Sithari's resource consumption against galactic sustainability indices. The Bureau determined that the Sithari were within acceptable parameters. The Bureau also determined, in a footnote of the assessment report, that the Sithari had submitted unusually precise numbers. The footnote was flagged for review. The review concluded that the Sithari had been honest. The conclusion was filed. 400 cycles later, the next census arrived. The Sithari submitted 3.5 billion. The Bureau processed the number. The Bureau noted that the Sithari population was growing at a measurable rate. The Bureau calculated that, projected forward over the next 8 cycles of census submissions, the Sithari would reach a population at which their consumption would meaningfully impact a neighboring system's resource allocation. The Bureau issued a preliminary resource reduction quota. It was a small quota, a polite quota. The Hesh arrived in 3 vessels. The Sithari did not understand what was happening. They had been honest. They had been within acceptable parameters. The Hesh explained, with the patience their species was known for, that the Sithari were not being punished. They were being adjusted. The Sithari were welcome to continue existing. They simply needed to exist at a different scale. 3 generations later, the Sithari no longer existed at any scale. The Bureau closed their membership file with a note of regret. The Hesh moved on to their next adjustment. The lesson, as the historians of the concordance would later phrase it, was distilled into a single principle that every species learned before their first census submission. Never tell the Bureau the truth. The truth is what the Bureau uses to decide who lives. Every member species was briefed on the Cathari extinction event. The briefing was standardized. It was delivered in the local language of the receiving species, accompanied by recordings of the final Cathari census submission, and concluded with a quiet recommendation that the receiving species consider their own definitions of accurate reporting. The recommendation was not a threat. It did not need to be. Humanity received the briefing in their delegation's first cycle. Dr. Margaret Holloway, the head of the Human Linguistic Compliance Team, sat through the entire presentation. She asked one question at the end. She asked whether the Bureau had ever published its definitions of the terms used in the census request. The presenting officer, a junior bureaucrat from the Clethney delegation, said that of course the Bureau had published its definitions. They were available in the Concordance Definitional Archive, Sublevel 12, accessible to any member species upon request. Dr. Holloway thanked the officer. She wrote down the location of the archive. She did not speak again for the remainder of the briefing. She would spend the next 4 years in Sublevel 12. Part 4. The year is cycle 847,225. The Concordance Definitional Archive sits beneath the administrative moon of Therx Prime, 18 levels below the surface, in a series of reading rooms that have not been substantively visited by any non-Bureau personnel in approximately 80,000 cycles. Riding the slow gravity lift down into Sublevel 12 is a 43-year-old human woman named Dr. Margaret Holloway. She is carrying a notebook. She is carrying nothing else. You might picture the human delegate to the Galactic Concordance as a diplomat, a soldier, a politician, a polished representative of a young, ambitious species. And in some other timeline, perhaps, she would have been. But Margaret Holloway was none of these things. She had taught semantic logic at a small university in the American Midwest for 19 years. She had 2 grown children, a husband who repaired antique clocks, and a deep, abiding hatred of public speaking. Her academic specialty was the legal interpretation of poorly drafted contracts. She had been selected for the human delegation because the selection committee had been looking for someone who would not make trouble. They had read her publication record and concluded she was harmless. This was, in retrospect, the most consequential miscalculation in the history of the Concordance. Holloway had read the standard briefing on the Cathari. She had watched the recording of their final submission. She had listened to the implicit recommendation about creative reporting. And then she had done something that, as far as the archive records show, no representative of any species had ever done before. She had taken the recommendation seriously. Not the implicit part, the explicit part. The part where the briefing officer had mentioned that the Bureau's definitions were publicly available in Sublevel 12. She had asked herself a question that none of her predecessors had thought to ask. If the Bureau is going to use our population number to decide whether to reduce us, what exactly does the Bureau mean by population? What exactly does the Bureau mean by individual? What exactly does the Bureau mean by the word human? She descended into Sublevel 12. She found the reading rooms empty. She located the definitional archive. She began to read. The archive was vast. It contained the legal definitions of every term used in every census request the Bureau had ever issued, going back 800,000 cycles. The definitions had been written by committees over enormous spans of time, edited by successor committees, amended by subcommittees, footnoted by clerks, and cross-referenced against each other in a sprawling, organic structure that no single entity had ever fully mapped. The definitions were precise. They were comprehensive. They were, in places, breathtakingly strange. Holloway read for 4 years. She read the definition of individual. She read the 740 footnotes attached to the definition of individual. She read the definition of lifespan, which included a subsection on what counted as the beginning and end of a life, and which had not been updated since cycle 312,008. She read the definition of population, which referenced the definition of member, which referenced the definition of present, which referenced the definition of existing, which referenced the definition of real. She filled 41 notebooks. She slept in the reading room. She emerged only to eat and to speak, very occasionally, to the definition clerks who maintained the archive. It was the definition clerks who would, without ever quite intending to, hand her the weapon. Part 5. The definition clerks of the concordance are not a species you have heard of. They were never meant to be visible. They are a small caste drawn from a handful of long-serving member species, selected in childhood for their tolerance of repetitive work and their lack of political ambition. Their job is to maintain the legal meanings of the words the Bureau uses. When a definition needs updating, the clerks update it. When two definitions contradict each other, the clerks resolve the contradiction with a footnote. When a footnote contradicts another footnote, the clerks add a sub-footnote. They have been doing this for 80,000 cycles. They are very, very good at it. No one talks to the definition clerks. Their work is considered beneath the notice of actual diplomats. Their reading rooms are considered places where careers go to die. They are paid in small sums of concordant script and in housing allowances on the lower levels of administrative moons. They are, in the formal hierarchy of the Bureau, the lowest functioning rank capable of independent decision-making. They are also, in functional terms, the only people in the entire galaxy who understand what the Bureau's words actually mean. Holloway noticed this within her first 3 weeks in the archive. She watched a junior clerk named Vethais Karen resolve a contradiction between two definitions of habitation by inserting a single qualifier into a footnote. The change took 30 seconds. It altered the legal status of approximately 14 billion entities across the galaxy. Vethais Karen did not appear to register the magnitude of what they had just done. They simply filed the amendment and moved on to the next contradiction. Holloway began bringing them tea. She did not bribe them, she did not flatter them. She did not, as far as the archive records show, ever ask them to do anything for her. She simply asked questions. What did this footnote mean? Why was this definition written this way? When was this exception added and what had it been responding to? The clerks, who had not been asked a substantive question about their work in living memory, answered her. They answered her at length. They began to look forward to her visits. They began to anticipate her questions. They began, very slowly and entirely without realizing it, to teach her the architecture of the entire concordance legal corpus. It was Vethais Karen who first noticed what Holloway was building. She had been mapping the definition of population for 11 months. She had traced the term through 312 cross-references. She had identified 84 exceptions, 41 historical amendments, and 17 entirely orphaned subclauses that had not been referenced in over 40,000 cycles. Vethais Karen looked at her notebook one afternoon, frowned in the way the clerk species frowned, and asked her what she was doing. Holloway answered honestly. She said she was reading the rules. Vethais Karen asked her why. Holloway said that her species was about to be asked a question, and she wanted to make sure she understood the question before she answered it. Vethais Karen considered this. Then they pointed to a particular footnote on a particular page in a particular definition, and they said, in the flat administrative tone of their caste, that if Holloway was reading the rules carefully, she might want to read that one twice. Holloway read it twice, then she read it a third time, then she sat very still for approximately 6 hours. When she finally stood up, she thanked Vethais Karen. She gathered her notebooks. She returned to the human delegation's quarters. She did not speak to anyone for 3 days, and then she began to draft the human census submission. It would take her another 2 years to finish. Part 6. To grasp the human cost of what Holloway had discovered, we have to return to that sealed reading chamber on Ethel 9 and to the archivist Curenvel, who was the first being in the galaxy to read the completed human submission. Curenvel received the slate on the morning of cycle 847,229. It was delivered through standard channels, in a standard housing, with a standard cover sheet. The cover sheet listed the submitting species as Homo sapiens sapiens, the submitting authority as the United Human Delegation, and the submission category as Quadrennial Population Range, Provisional Member, Cycle 4. Everything was in order. Everything was routine. Curanvel made a note in his daily log indicating that he expected the submission to take approximately 12 minutes to process. It took him 14 hours. The first part of the submission was unremarkable. The human delegation reported a lower bound of 8.1 billion. This was consistent with the Bureau's own estimates of the human population. It was within the expected range. It suggested that humanity had decided, like every species before them, to submit a survivable number. Curanvel began to relax. He had been mildly concerned about the humans. They were new, and new species sometimes made mistakes. This submission suggested they had absorbed the implicit lessons of the briefing. Then he reached the upper bound. The number was followed by a notation. The notation indicated that the upper bound was qualified by a definitional addendum attached to the submission, which the Bureau was legally required to incorporate into its assessment under Subclause 47 of the Census Definitional Charter. Curanvel had never heard of Subclause 47. He opened the addendum. The addendum was 847 pages long. It began with a section titled on the definition of individual. The section noted that the Concordance Definitional Archive defined an individual as any discrete entity capable of independent cognitive activity, which the archive further defined as the capacity for self-referential thought, which the archive further defined, in a footnote dated Cycle 312,008, as any system possessing the structural prerequisites for first-person modeling, regardless of substrate, duration, or scale. The addendum noted that this definition had never been formally amended. The addendum noted that humans, having read this definition carefully, had concluded that it applied to a number of categories of entity that the Bureau had not previously considered. The addendum then listed those categories. It listed every human currently alive, 8.1 billion entities. This was the lower bound. It listed every human who had ever lived and whose neural patterns had been recorded, archived, or modeled in any computational substrate currently maintained by humanity. 117 billion entities. Humans, the addendum noted, had been digitally archiving their dead for 140 years. The archives were complete. The patterns were preserved. The patterns met the structural prerequisites for first-person modeling. Under the Bureau's own definition, they qualified as individuals. It listed every human currently existing as a simulated consciousness in a research, entertainment, or commemorative substrate. 400 billion entities. Humans, the addendum noted, had a flourishing industry in conscious simulation. The simulations met the definition. It listed every potential human encoded in the genetic and epigenetic data currently held in human reproductive archives. The addendum acknowledged that this was an unusual category. It also noted that the Bureau's definition of individual, in footnote 214, included potential entities whose structural prerequisites were fully specified and retrievable. Humanity had 200 million reproductive archives. The combinatorial space of retrievable individuals exceeded the storage capacity of Curanvel's reading slate. The slate cracked at this point. Curanvel watched the fracture propagate across the crystalline surface. He set the slate down very carefully. He continued reading from the backup substrate. The addendum went on. It listed every human consciousness currently distributed across networked cognitive prosthetics, which had been ruled to constitute distinct individuals under a 1990s court decision that the humans had thoughtfully translated into concordance legal format. It listed every human personality fragment preserved in long-duration grief therapy archives. It listed the projected populations of every human colony plan that had been formally funded, on the grounds that funded plans constituted under subclause 112, retrievable structural specifications. The upper bound, when Curanvel finally reached it, was a number he could not read, not because it was unprintable, because his crystalline mind, which had been engineered over 40 million cycles to hold the population counts of galactic arms, could not stably represent the value. The number kept slipping out of working memory. He had to write it down in 3 separate notations to verify that he had transcribed it correctly. He sat in the reading chamber for a long time. He looked at the cracked slate. He looked at his daily log, in which he had written that this submission would take 12 minutes. He looked at the 847 pages of definitional addendum, every page of which was footnoted, cross-referenced, and citationally grounded in the concordance's own legal corpus. The humans had not lied. They had not exaggerated. They had not invented a single category that the Bureau had not already defined. They had simply read the definitions and answered the question completely. Curanvel did the only thing he could do. He filed the submission. Part 7. If you thought the cracking of one slate in one reading chamber was a quiet event, the concordance was about to discover what happens when a single honest answer enters a system designed to process only lies. The human submission propagated through the Bureau's network in the way all submissions did, automatically, by standard distribution protocol. Within 6 hours, it had reached the Census Assessment Division. Within 12, it had reached the Resource Sustainability Index calculators. Within 20, it had reached the desks of 47 other member species, each of whom received standard comparative reports showing how their own submissions stacked up against their galactic neighbors. The Clethni delegation received the report first. They read the human numbers. They read the addendum. They sat in silence for several hours. Then they began, very urgently, to read the concordance definitional archive themselves. The Bromal Confederacy received the report next. Their entire Ministry of Conservative Estimation was summoned to an emergency session. The minister, an elderly bureaucrat who had spent her career producing survivable numbers, read the human submission and laughed for the first time in 40 cycles. Then she ordered her entire ministry to begin drafting a definitional addendum of their own. The Oregon migratory flocks received the report. They read the addendum. They convened their flight council. The council voted, unanimously, to formally adopt the human interpretation of the term individual for all future census submissions. Their projected population, under the new interpretation, increased by a factor of 2004. The Hesh Fleet received the report through their administrative liaison. The fleet's command council read the human numbers. They read the addendum. They calculated what their adjustment procedures would look like if applied to humanity at the upper bound of the submitted range. The calculation took approximately 40 seconds. The result was that the entire Hesh Fleet, operating continuously for the remaining lifespan of the galaxy, would not be sufficient to adjust humanity to a survivable threshold. The Fleet Command Council filed a quiet recommendation to the Bureau, suggesting that perhaps no adjustment should be attempted. The Bureau convened an emergency session. The session was attended by the senior bureaucracy, the definition clerks, and the surviving members of 7 previous census assessment committees, recalled from retirement for the occasion. The session lasted 41 days. The transcripts are sealed. What is known is that the Bureau attempted, repeatedly, to issue a correction to the human submission. Each correction required clarifying a definition. Each clarified definition turned out to be cross-referenced to 17 other definitions. Each of those definitions, when examined carefully, was found to support the human interpretation. The Bureau's own legal corpus, written over 800,000 cycles by 10,000 committees, was internally consistent in exactly the way that allowed the human submission to stand. Every correction the Bureau tried to issue made the number larger. When the Bureau attempted to exclude archived neural patterns, the definition clerks pointed out that doing so would require amending the definition of individual, in a way that would also exclude 11 member species whose biology relied on cognitive distribution. When the Bureau attempted to exclude potential individuals encoded in reproductive archives, the clerks noted that the same exclusion would invalidate the population counts of the Oregon flocks, who had relied on potential counting for 40,000 cycles. When the Bureau attempted to limit the addendum to substrates currently active, the clerks observed that the proposed limitation would also require recategorizing the entire Clethne species, whose religious practices involved dormant ancestral simulations. There was no correction the Bureau could issue that did not, in some way, make things worse. The system that had been built to maintain stable, predictable, survivable numbers had been built on a foundation of definitions so generous, so carefully expanded over so many cycles, that when one species finally read them honestly, the entire foundation gave way. The Bureau did not announce a decision. The Bureau simply, on the 42nd day of the emergency session, stopped issuing census requests. There was no formal cancellation. There was no farewell address. The next census, which would have been due in 400 cycles, was quietly not sent. The one after that was also not sent. The Hesh fleet was reassigned to harbor patrol. The resource reduction quota system was suspended pending review. The review has not concluded. It is not expected to conclude. The concordance still exists, technically. It still maintains its administrative moons, its reading rooms, its definition clerks, but it no longer counts. It cannot afford to. Part 8. Today, if you travel to Ethel 9, you can still descend into the sealed reading chamber where Curanvel first cracked his slate. The chamber is open to extinct species historians, and to those few researchers permitted to study the strange brief period when humanity was a member of the galactic community. The slate is still there. It still bears the fracture line that propagated across its surface on the morning of cycle 847,229. The addendum is still archived, all 847 pages, in the original human language and in 17 authorized translations. No one has updated the file in 300 cycles. No one needs to. The story of what humanity did to the concordance census is not a story about war. It is not a story about deception. It is not even, when you look at it carefully, a story about cleverness. It is a story about what happens when a species takes a question seriously. Margaret Holloway was not a hero in the way her own species understood the word. She did not lead anyone. She did not give speeches. She did not, after the submission was filed, return to public life. She went back to her small university in the American Midwest and resumed teaching semantic logic to undergraduates, most of whom never knew what she had done. She died at the age of 81, of natural causes, in a small house that smelled faintly of the antique clocks her husband had spent his life repairing. Her obituary in the local newspaper mentioned her academic publications and her 2 children. It did not mention the concordance. Vethais Karen, the definition clerk who had pointed her toward the footnote, continued working in sublevel 12 for another 400 cycles before retiring. They never publicly discussed their role in the events of cycle 847,229. When asked, late in life, whether they had known what Holloway was building, they answered honestly. They said that of course they had known. They said that Holloway was the only person who had ever asked them what the words meant. They said that when someone asks you what the words mean, you have an obligation to tell them. The concordance never recovered. Not in the way it had been. It still exists as an administrative structure, still maintains its archives, still holds its sessions. But the great machine of the census, the patient 800,000 cycle system of polite assessment and resource reduction quotas, has not operated since the day Curanvel filed the human submission. The Hesh, with no adjustments to perform, have become harbor pilots and ceremonial guards. The Bureau, with no numbers to process, has become a kind of museum of itself. What humanity won on that day was not territory, not resources, not power in any of the senses that other species understood. What humanity won was a redefinition of the terms on which the galaxy operated. They did not break the rules. They followed them exactly, completely, and to their full implications. They proved that a system built on the unspoken agreement that no one would ever take it seriously could not survive a single species choosing to take it seriously. This is what I want you to sit with, in the quiet of wherever you are listening from. The concordance did not fall to weapons. It did not fall to alliances. It did not fall to any of the things great empires usually fall to. It fell to a 43-year-old human woman with a notebook who descended into a basement and read the rules. This history leaves us with a haunting question, and I want you to answer it honestly. If a question is asked in bad faith, asked with the unspoken expectation that you will lie, asked as part of a system that depends on your dishonesty for its own survival, is an honest answer still honest? Or does honesty become something else, something sharper, something the question's askers never intended to receive? What would you have done in Margaret Holloway's place, sitting in sublevel 12 with 80,000 cycles of definitions in front of you and the implicit recommendation of the Bureau still echoing in your ears? Would you have submitted the survivable number like every species before you? Or would you have read the rules? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments below. It is a strange, uncomfortable question, and the answer says more about us than it does about the concordance. If you found this descent into the cracked vaults of the Galactic Census compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows me to keep uncovering these forgotten moments when small, quiet beings did large, permanent things. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video, where we will uncover another strange chapter of our shared galactic past.